Section 6 of The Minister's Wooing. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Minister's Wooing by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Chapter 5. The Letter. Mary returned to the quietude of her room. The red of twilight had faded, and the silver moon, round and fair, was rising behind the thick boughs of the apple trees. She sat down in the window, thoughtful and sad, and listened to the crickets, whose ignorant jollity often sounds as mournfully to us mortals as ours may to superior beings. There the little hoarse black wretches were scraping and creaking as if life and death were invented solely for their pleasure, and the world were created only to give them a good time in it. Now and then a little wind shivered among the boughs and brought down a shower of white petals which shimmered in the slant beams of the moonlight, and now a ray touched some tall head of grass, and forthwith it blossomed into silver and stirred itself with a quiet joy, like a newborn saint just awaking in paradise. And ever and anon came on the still air the soft eternal pulsations of the distant sea, sound mournfulest, most mysterious of all the harpings of nature. It was the sea, the deep eternal sea, the treacherous, soft, dreadful, inexplicable sea, and he was perhaps at this moment being borne away on it, away, away, to what sorrows, to what temptations, to what dangers, she knew not. She looked along the old, familiar, beaten path by which he came, by which he went, and thought, what if he never should come back? There was a little path through the orchard out to a small elevation in the pasture lot behind, whence the sea was distinctly visible, and Mary had often used her low-silled window as a door when she wanted to pass out thither. So now she stepped out and, gathering her skirts back from the dewy grass, walked thoughtfully along the path and gained the hill. Newport Harbor lay stretched out in the distance, with the rising moon casting a long, wavering track of silver upon it, and vessels, like silver-winged moths, were turning and shifting slowly to and fro upon it, and one stately ship in full sail passing fairly out under her white canvas, graceful as some grand snowy bird. Mary's beating heart told her that there was passing away from her one who carried a portion of her existence with him. She sat down under a lonely tree that stood there, and resting her elbow on her knee, followed the ship with silent prayers as it passed like a graceful, cloudy dream out of her sight. Then she thoughtfully retraced her way to her chamber, and as she was entering, observed in the now clearer moonlight what she had not seen before, something white like a letter lying on the floor. Immediately she struck a light, and there, sure enough, it was, a letter in James's handsome, dashing hand, and the little puss, before she knew what she was about, actually kissed it, with a fervour which would much have astonished the writer, could he at that moment have been clairvoyant. But Mary felt as one who finds in the emptiness after a friend's death an unexpected message or memento, and all alone in the white, calm stillness of her little room, her heart took sudden possession of her. She opened the letter with trembling hands and read what, of course, we shall let you read. We got it out of a bundle of old, smoky yellow letters, years after all the parties concerned were gone on the eternal journey beyond earth. My dear Mary, I cannot leave you so. I have about 200 things to say to you, and it's a shame I could not have had longer to see you. But blessed be ink and paper. I am writing and seeing to 50 things besides, so you mustn't wonder if my letter has rather a confused appearance. I have been thinking that perhaps I gave you a wrong impression of myself this afternoon. I am going to speak to you from my heart, as if I were confessing on my deathbed. Well, then, I do not confess to being what is commonly called a bad young man. I should be willing that men of the world generally, even strict ones, should look my life through and know all about it. It is only in your presence, Mary, that I feel that I am bad and low and shallow and mean, because you represent to me a sphere higher and holier than any in which I have ever moved, and stir up a sort of sighing and longing in my heart to come towards it. In all countries and all temptations, Mary, your image has stood between me and low, gross vice. When I have been with fellows roaring drunken, beastly songs, suddenly I have seemed to see you as you used to sit beside me in the singing school, and your voice has been like an angel's in my ear, and I've got up and gone out sick and disgusted. Your face has risen up calm and white and still between the faces of poor lost creatures who know no better way of life than to tempt us to sin. And sometimes, Mary, when I have seen girls that, had they been cared for by good, pious mothers, might have been like you, I have felt as if I could cry for them. Poor women are abused all the world over, and it's no wonder they turn round and revenge themselves on us. No, I have not been bad, Mary, as the world calls badness. I have been kept by you. But do you remember you told me once that when the snow first fell and lay so dazzling and pure and soft all about, you always felt as if the spreads and window curtains that seemed white before were dirty? Well, it's just like that with me. Your presence makes me feel that I am not pure, that I am low and unworthy, not worthy to touch the hem of your garment. Your good Dr. H. spent a whole half day the other Sunday trying to tell us about the beauty of holiness, and he cut and pared and peeled and sliced and told us what it wasn't and what was like it and wasn't. And then he built up an exact definition and fortified and bricked it up all round. And I thought to myself that he'd better tell 'em to look at Mary Scudder, and they'd understand all about it. That was what I was thinking when you talked to me for looking at you in church instead of looking towards the pulpit. It really made me laugh in myself to see what a good little ignorant, unconscious way you had of looking up at the doctor as if he knew more about that than you did. And now, as to your doctor that you think so much of, I like him for certain things in certain ways. He is a great, grand, large pattern of a man who isn't afraid to think and to speak anything he does think. But then I do believe if he would take a voyage round the world in the forecastle of a whaler, he would know more about what to say to people than he does now. It would certainly give him several new points to be considered. Much of his preaching about men is as like live men as Chinese pictures of trees and rocks and gardens, no nearer the reality than that. All I can say is it isn't so, and you'd know it, sir, if you knew men. He has got what they call a system, just so many bricks put together just so. But it is too narrow to take in all I see in my wanderings round this world of ours. Nobody that has a soul and goes round the world as I do can help feeling it at times and thinking as he sees all the races of men and their ways, who made them and what they were made for. To doubt the existence of a God seems to me like a want of common sense. There is a maker and a ruler, doubtless. But then, Mary, all this invisible world of religion is unreal to me. I can see we must be good somehow, that if we are not, we shall not be happy here or hereafter. As to all the metaphysics of your good doctor, you can't tell how they tire me. I'm not the sort of person that they can touch. I must have real things, real people. Abstractions are nothing to me. Then I think that he systematically contradicts on one Sunday what he preaches on another. One Sunday he tells us that God is the immediate, efficient author of every act of will. The next he tells us that we are entire free agents. I see no sense in it and can't take the trouble to put it together. But then he and you have something in you that I call religion, something that makes you good. When I see a man working away on an entirely honest, unworldly, disinterested pattern as he does, and when I see you, Mary, as I said before, I should like at least to be as you are, whether I could believe as you do or not. How could you so care for me and waste on one so unworthy of you such love? Oh, Mary, some better man must win you. I never shall and never can. But then you must not quite forget me. You must be my friend, my saint. If through your prayers, your Bible, your friendship, you can bring me to your state, I am willing to be brought there, nay, desirous. God has put the key of my soul into your hands. So, dear Mary, goodbye. Pray still for your naughty, loving cousin James. Mary read this letter and reread it with more pain than pleasure. To feel the immortality of a beloved soul hanging upon us, to feel that its only communications with heaven must be through us, is the most solemn and touching thought that can pervade a mind. It was without one particle of gratified vanity, with even a throb of pain, that she read such exalted praises of herself from one blind to the glories of a far higher loveliness. Yet was she at that moment, unknown to herself, one of the great company scattered through earth who are priests unto God, ministering between the Divine One who has unveiled himself unto them, and those who as yet stand in the outer courts of the great sanctuary of truth and holiness. Many a heart, wrung, pierced, bleeding with the sins and sorrows of earth, longing to depart, stands in this mournful and beautiful ministry, but stands unconscious of the glory of the work in which it waits and suffers. God's kings and priests are crowned with thorns, walking the earth with bleeding feet and comprehending not the work they are performing. Mary took from a drawer a small pocket-book, from which dropped a lock of black hair, a glossy curl which seemed to have a sort of wicked, wilful life in every shining ring, just as she had often seen it shake naughtily on the owner's head. She felt a strange tenderness towards the little wilful thing, and as she leaned over it, made in her heart 1,000 fond apologies for every fault and error. She was standing thus when Mrs. Scudder entered the room to see if her daughter had yet retired. "What are you doing there, Mary?" she said, as her eye fell on the letter. "What is it you are reading?" Mary felt herself grow pale. It was the first time in her whole life that her mother had asked her a question that she was not from the heart ready to answer. Her loyalty to her only parent had gone on even-handed with that she gave to her God. She felt somehow that the revelations of that afternoon had opened a gulf between them, and the consciousness overpowered her. Mrs. Scudder was astonished at her evident embarrassment, her trembling and paleness. She was a woman of prompt, imperative temperament, and the slightest hesitation in rendering to her a full outspoken confidence had never before occurred in their intercourse. Her child was the core of her heart, the apple of her eye, and intense love is always near neighbor to anger. There was therefore an involuntary flash from her eye and a heightening of her color as she said, "Mary, are you concealing anything from your mother?" In that moment Mary had grown calm again. The wonted, serene, balanced nature had found its habitual poise, and she looked up innocently, though with tears in her large blue eyes, and said, "No, mother, I have nothing that I do not mean to tell you fully. This letter came from James Marvyn. He came here to see me this afternoon. Here? When? I did not see him. After dinner. I was sitting here in the window, and suddenly he came up behind me through the orchard path. Mrs. Katy sat down with a flushed cheek and a discomposed air, but Mary seemed actually to bear her down by the candid clearness of the large blue eye which she turned on her as she stood perfectly collected, with her deadly pale face and a brilliant spot burning on each cheek. James came to say good-bye. He complained that he had not had a chance to see me alone since he came home. "And what should he want to see you alone for?" said Mrs. Scudder in a dry, disturbed tone. "Mother, everybody has things at times which they would like to say to some one person alone," said Mary. "Well, tell me what he said." "I will try. In the first place, he said that he always had been free all his life to run in and out of our house, and to wait on me like a brother." "H'm," said Mrs. Scudder. "But he isn't your brother for all that." "Well, then he wanted to know why you were so cold to him, and why you never let him walk with me from meetings, or see me alone as we often used to. And I told him why, that we were not children now, and that you thought it was not best. And then I talked with him about religion, and tried to persuade him to attend to the concerns of his soul, and I never felt so much hope for him as I do now." Aunt Katy looked skeptical and remarked, "If he really felt a disposition for religious instruction, Dr. H. could guide him much better than you could." "Yes, so I told him, and I tried to persuade him to talk with Dr. H., but he was very unwilling. He said I could have more influence over him than anybody else, that nobody could do him any good but me." "Yes, yes, I understand all that," said Aunt Katy. "I've heard young men say that before, and I know just what it amounts to. But, Mother, I do think James was moved very much this afternoon. I never heard him speak so seriously. He seemed really in earnest, and he asked me to give him my Bible." "Couldn't he read any Bible but yours?" "Why, naturally, you know, Mother, he would like my Bible better, because it would put him in mind of me. He promised faithfully to read it all through." "And then it seems he wrote you a letter." "Yes, Mother." Mary shrank from showing this letter from the natural sense of honor which makes us feel it indelicate to expose to an unsympathizing eye the confidential outpourings of another heart. And then she felt quite sure that there was no such intercessor for James in her mother's heart as in her own. But over all this reluctance rose the determined force of duty, and she handed the letter in silence to her mother. Mrs. Scudder took it, laid it deliberately in her lap, and then began searching in the pocket of her chintz petticoat for her spectacles. These being found, she wiped them, accurately adjusted them, opened the letter, and spread it on her lap, brushing out its folds and straightening it, that she might read with the greater ease. After this, she read it carefully and deliberately, and all this while there was such a stillness that the sound of the tall, varnished clock in the best room could be heard through the half-open door. After reading it with the most tiresome, torturing slowness, she rose and, laying it on the table under Mary's eye and pressing down her finger on 2 lines in the letter, said, "Mary, have you told James that you loved him?" "Yes, Mother, always. I always loved him, and he always knew it." "But, Mary, this that he speaks of is something different. What has passed between—" "Why, Mother, he was saying that we who were Christians drew to ourselves and did not care for the salvation of our friends. And then I told him how I had always prayed for him, and how I should be willing even to give up my hopes in heaven if he might be saved." "Child, what do you mean?" "I mean, if only one of us 2 could go to heaven, I had rather it should be him than me," said Mary. "Oh, child, child!" said Mrs. Scudder with a sort of groan. "Has it gone with you so far as this? Poor child, after all my care, you are in love with this boy. Your heart is set on him." "Mother, I am not. I never expect to see him much, never expect to marry him or anybody else. Only he seems to me to have so much more life and soul and spirit than most people. I think him so noble and grand, that is, that he could be if he were all he ought to be, that somehow I never think of myself in thinking of him, and his salvation seems worth more than mine. Men can do so much more. They can live such splendid lives. Oh, a real noble man is so glorious." "And you would like to see him well married, would you not?" said Mrs. Scudder, sending with a true woman's aim this keen arrow into the midst of the cloud of enthusiasm which enveloped her daughter. "I think," she added, "that Jane Spencer would make him an excellent wife." Mary was astonished at a strange new pain that shot through her at these words. She drew in her breath and turned herself uneasily, as one who had literally felt a keen dividing blade piercing between soul and spirit. Till this moment she had never been conscious of herself, but the shaft had torn the veil. She covered her face with her hands, the hot blood flushed scarlet over neck and brow. At last, with a beseeching look, she threw herself into her mother's arms. "Oh, mother, mother, I am selfish after all." Mrs. Scudder folded her silently to her heart and said, "My daughter, that is not at all what I wished it to be. I see how it is. But then you have been a good child. I don't blame you. We can't always help ourselves. We don't always really know how we do feel. I didn't know for a long while that I loved your father. I thought I was only curious about him because he had a strange way of treating me, different from other men. But one day, I remember, Julian Simons told me that it was reported that his mother was making a match for him with Susan Emery, and I was astonished to find how I felt. I saw him that evening, and the moment he looked at me, I saw it wasn't true. All at once I knew something I never knew before, and that was that I should be very unhappy if he loved any one else better than me. But then, my child, your father was a different man from James. He was as much better than I was as you are than James. I was a foolish, thoughtless young thing then. I never should have been anything at all but for him. Somehow, when I loved him, I grew more serious, and that he always guided and led me. Mary, your father was a wonderful man. He was one of the sort that the world knows not of. Sometime I must show you his letters. I always hoped, my daughter, that you would marry such a man." "Don't speak of marrying, mother. I never shall marry." "You certainly should not, unless you can marry in the Lord. Remember the words, 'Be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness? And what communion hath light with darkness? And what concord hath Christ with Belial? Or what part hath he that believeth with an infidel?'" "Mother, James is not an infidel." "He certainly is an unbeliever, Mary, by his own confession. But then God is a sovereign and hath mercy on whom he will. You do right to pray for him, but if he does not come out on the Lord's side, you must not let your heart mislead you. He is going to be gone 3 years, and you must try to think as little of him as possible. Put your mind upon your duties like a good girl, and God will bless you. Don't believe too much in your power over him. Young men, when they are in love, will promise anything and really think they mean it, but nothing is a saving change except what is wrought in them by sovereign grace." "But, mother, does not God use the love we have to each other as a means of doing us good? Did you not say that it was by your love to father that you first were led to think seriously?" "That is true, my child," said Mrs. Scudder. who, like many of the rest of the world, was surprised to meet her own words walking out on a track where she had not expected them, but was yet too true of soul to cut their acquaintance because they were not going the way of her wishes. Yes, all that is true. But yet, Mary, when one has but one little ewe lamb in the world, one is jealous of it. I would give all the world if you had never seen James. It is dreadful enough for a woman to love anybody as you can, but it is more to love a man of unsettled character and no religion. But then the Lord appoints all our goings. It is not in man that walketh to direct his steps. I leave you, my child, in his hands. And with one solemn and long embrace, the mother and daughter parted for the night. It is impossible to write a story of New England life and manners for a thoughtless, shallow-minded person. If we represent things as they are, their intensity, their depth, their unworldly gravity and earnestness must inevitably repel lighter spirits, as the reverse pole of the magnet drives off sticks and straws. In no other country were the soul and the spiritual life ever such intense realities, and everything contemplated so much, to use a current New England phrase, in reference to eternity. Mrs. Scudder was a strong, clear-headed, practical woman. No one had a clearer estimate of the material and outward life, or could more minutely manage its smallest item. But then a tremendous eternal future had so weighed down and compacted the fibers of her very soul that all earthly things were but as dust in comparison to it. That her child should be one elected to walk in white, to reign with Christ when earth was a forgotten dream, was her one absorbing wish, and she looked on all the events of life only with reference to this. The way of life was narrow, the chances in favor of any child of Adam infinitely small. The best, the most seemingly pure and fair, was by nature a child of wrath, and could be saved only by a sovereign decree, by which it should be plucked as a brand from the burning. Therefore it was that, weighing all things in one balance, there was the sincerity of her whole being in the dread which she felt at the thought of her daughter's marriage with an unbeliever. Mrs. Scudder, after retiring to her room, took her Bible in preparation for her habitual nightly exercise of devotion before going to rest. She read and reread a chapter, scarce thinking what she was reading, aroused herself, and then sat with the book in her hand in deep thought. James Marvyn was her cousin's son, and she had a strong feeling of respect and family attachment for his father. She had, too, a real kindness for the young man, whom she regarded as a well-meaning, willful youngster, but that he should touch her saint, her Mary, that he should take from her the daughter who was her all, really embittered her heart towards him. After all, she said to herself, there are 3 years in which there will be no letters, or perhaps only 1 or 2, and a great deal may be done in 3 years if one is wise. And she felt within herself an arousing of all the shrewd, womanly, and motherly tact of her nature to meet this new emergency. End of section 6. Section 7 of The Minister's Wooing. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Minister's Wooing by Harriet Beecher Stowe, Chapter 6. The Doctor. It is seldom that man and woman come together in intimate association unless influences are at work more subtle and mysterious than the subjects of them dream. Even in cases where the strongest ruling force of the two sexes seems out of the question, there is still something peculiar and insidious in their relationship. A fatherly old gentleman, who undertakes the care of a sprightly young girl, finds to his astonishment that little miss spins all sorts of cobwebs round him. Grave professors and teachers cannot give lessons to their female pupils just as they give them to the coarser sex. And more than once has the fable of Cadenus and Vanessa been acted over by the most unlikely performers. The doctor was a philosopher, a metaphysician, a philanthropist, and in the highest and most earnest sense a minister of good on earth. The New England clergy had no sentimental affectation of sanctity that segregated them from wholesome human relations, and consequently our good doctor had always resolved, in a grave and thoughtful spirit, at a suitable time in his worldly affairs, to choose unto himself a helpmeet. Love, as treated of in romances, he held to be a foolish and profane matter, unworthy the attention of a serious and reasonable creature. All the language of poetry on this subject was to him an unknown tongue. He contemplated the entrance on married life somewhat in this wise, that at a time and place suiting he should look out unto himself a woman of a pleasant countenance and of good repute, a zealous, earnest Christian, and well skilled in the items of household management, whom, accosting as a stranger and pilgrim to a better life, he should loyally and lovingly entreat, as Isaac did Rebekah, to come under the shadow of his tent, and be a helpmeet unto him in what yet remained of this mortal journey. But straitened circumstances and the unsettled times of the Revolution, in which he had taken an earnest and zealous part, had delayed to a late bachelorhood the fulfilment of this resolution. When once received under the shadow of Mrs. Scudder's roof, and within the provident sphere of her unfailing housekeeping, all material necessity for an immediate choice was taken away, for he was in exactly that situation dearest to every scholarly and thoughtful man, in which all that pertained to the outward life appeared to rise under his hand at the moment he wished for it, without his knowing how or why. He was not at the head of a prosperous church and society, rich and well-to-do in the world, but as the pioneer leader of a new theology, in a country where theology was the all-absorbing interest, he had to breast the reaction that ever attends the advent of new ideas. His pulpit talents, too, were unattractive. His early training had been all logical, not in the least aesthetic. For, like the ministry of his country generally, he had been trained always to think more of what he should say than of how he should say it. Consequently, his style, though not without a certain massive greatness, which always comes from largeness of nature, had none of those attractions by which the common masses are beguiled into thinking. He gave only the results of thought, not its incipient processes, and the consequence was that few could follow him. In like manner, his religious teachings were characterized by an ideality so high as quite to discourage ordinary virtue. There is a ladder to heaven, whose base God has placed in human affections, tender instincts, symbolic feelings, sacraments of love, through which the soul rises higher and higher, refining as she goes till she outgrows the human, and changes as she rises into the image of the divine. At the very top of this ladder, at the threshold of paradise, blazes dazzling and crystalline that celestial grade where the soul knows self no more, having learned through a long experience of devotion how blessed it is to lose herself in that eternal love and beauty, of which all earthly fairness and grandeur are but the dim type, the distant shadow. This highest step, this saintly elevation, which but few selectest spirits ever on earth attain, to raise the soul to which the Eternal Father organized every relation of human existence and strung every chord of human love, for which this world is one long discipline, for which the soul's human education is constantly varied, for which it is now torn by sorrow, now flooded by joy, to which all its multiplied powers tend with upward hands of dumb and ignorant aspiration, this Ultima Thule of virtue had been seized upon by our sage as the all of religion. He knocked out every round of the ladder but the highest, and then, pointing to its hopeless splendor, said to the world, "Go up thither and be saved." Short of that absolute self-abnegation, that unconditional surrender to the infinite, there was nothing meritorious, because if that were commanded, every moment of refusal was rebellion. Every prayer not based on such consecration he held to be an insult to the divine majesty. The reading of the word, the conscientious conduct of life, the performance of the duties of man to man, being without this, the deeds of a creature in conscious rebellion to its eternal sovereign, were all vitiated and made void. Nothing was to be preached to the sinner but his ability and obligation to rise immediately to this height. It is not wonderful that teaching of this sort should seem to many unendurable, and that the multitude should desert the preacher with the cry, "This is an hard saying, who can hear it?" The young and gay were wearied by the dryness of metaphysical discussions, which to them were as unintelligible as a statement of the last results of the mathematician to the child commencing the multiplication table. There remained around him only a select circle, shrewd, hard thinkers who delighted in metaphysical subtleties, deep-hearted, devoted natures, who sympathized with the unworldly purity of his life, his active philanthropy and untiring benevolence, courageous men who admired his independence of thought and freedom in breasting received opinions, and those unperceiving, dull, good people who are content to go to church anywhere as convenience and circumstances may drift them, people who serve among the keen-feeling and thinking portion of the world much the same purpose as adipose matter in the human system, as a soft cushion between the nerves of feeling and the muscles of activity. There was something affecting in the pertinacity with which the good doctor persevered in saying his say to his discouraging minority of hearers. His salary was small, his meeting house, damaged during the revolutionary struggle, was dilapidated and forlorn. Fireless in winter, and in summer admitting a flood of sun and dust through those great windows which formed so principal a feature in those first efforts of Puritan architecture. Still, grand in his humility, he preached on, and as a soldier never asks why, but stands at apparently the most useless post, so he went on from Sunday to Sunday, comforting himself with the reflection that no one could think more meanly of his ministrations than he did himself. "I am like Moses only in not being eloquent," he said in his simplicity. "My preaching is barren and dull, my voice is hard and harsh, but then the Lord is a sovereign and may work through me. He fed Elijah once through a raven, and he may feed some poor wandering soul through me." The only mistake made by the good man was that of supposing that the elaboration of theology was preaching the gospel. The gospel he was preaching constantly by his pure, unworldly living, by his visitations to homes of poverty and sorrow, by his searching out of the lowly African slaves, his teaching of those whom no one else in those days had thought of teaching, and by the grand humanity outrunning his age in which he protested against the then admitted system of slavery and the slave trade. But when, rising in the pulpit, he followed trains of thought suited only to the desk of the theological lecture room, he did it blindly, following that law of self-development by which minds of a certain amount of fervor must utter what is in them, whether men will hear or whether they will forbear. But the place where our doctor was happiest was his study. There he explored and wandered and read and thought and lived a life as wholly ideal and intellectual as heart could conceive. And could love enter a reverend doctor's study and find his way into a heart empty and swept of all those shreds of poetry and romance in which he usually finds the material of his incantations? Even so. But he came so thoughtfully, so reverently, with so wise and cautious a footfall that the good doctor never even raised his spectacles to see who was there. The first that he knew, poor man, he was breathing an air of strange and subtle sweetness, from what paradise he never stopped his studies to inquire. He was like a great rugged elm, with all its lacings and archings of boughs and twigs, which has stood cold and frozen against the metallic blue of winter's sky, forgetful of leaves, and patient in its bareness, calmly content in its naked strength and crystalline definiteness of outline. But in April there is a rising and stirring within the grand old monster, a whispering of nodded buds, a mounting of sap coursing ethereally from bough to bough with a warm and gentle life, and though the old elm knows it not, a new creation is at hand. Just so, ever since the good man had lived at Mrs. Scudder's, and had the gentle Mary for his catechumen, a richer life seemed to have coloured his thoughts. His mind seemed to work with a pleasure never felt before. Whoever looked on the forehead of the good doctor must have seen the squareness of ideality giving marked effect to its outline. As yet, ideality had dealt only with the intellectual and invisible, leading to subtle refinements of argument and exalted ideas of morals. But there was lying in him, crude and unworked, a whole mine of those artistic feelings and perceptions which are awakened and developed only by the touch of beauty. Had he been born beneath the shadow of the great Duomo of Florence, where Giotto's campanile rises like the slender stalk of a celestial lily, where varied marbles and rainbow glass and gorgeous paintings and lofty statuary call forth even from childhood the soul's reminiscences of the bygone glories of its pristine state, his would have been a soul as rounded and full in its sphere of faculties as that of Da Vinci or Michelangelo. But of all that he was as ignorant as a child, and the first revelation of his dormant nature was to come to him through the face of woman, that work of the mighty master which is to be found in all lands and ages. What makes the love of a great mind something fearful in its inception is, that it is often the unsealing of a hitherto undeveloped portion of a large and powerful being. The woman may or may not seem to other eyes adequate to the effect produced, but the man cannot forget her, because with her came a change which makes him forever a different being. So it was with our friend. A woman it was that was destined to awaken in him all that consciousness which music, painting, poetry awaken in more evenly developed minds, and it is the silent breathing of her creative presence that is even now creating him anew, while as yet he knows it not. He never thought, this good old soul, whether Mary were beautiful or not. He never even knew that he looked at her, nor did he know why it was that the truths of his theology, when uttered by her tongue, had such a wondrous beauty as he never felt before. He did not know why it was that when she silently sat by him, copying tangled manuscript for the press, as she sometimes did, his whole study seemed so full of some divine influence, as if, like Saint Dorothea, she had worn in her bosom invisibly the celestial roses of paradise. He recorded honestly in his diary what marvelous freshness of spirit the Lord had given him, and how he seemed to be uplifted in his communings with heaven, without once thinking from the robes of what angel this sweetness had exhaled. On Sundays, when he saw good Mrs. Jones asleep, and Simon Brown's hard, sharp eyes, and Deacon Twitchell mournfully rocking to and fro, and his wife handing fennel to keep the children awake, his eye glanced across to the front gallery, where one earnest young face, ever kindling with feeling and bright with intellect, followed on his way, and he felt uplifted and comforted. On Sunday mornings, when Mary came out of her little room in clean white dress, with her singing book and psalm book in her hands, her deep eyes solemn from recent prayer, he thought of that fair and mystical bride, the Lamb's wife, whose union with her divine Redeemer in a future millennial age was a frequent and favorite subject of his musings. Yet he knew not that this celestial bride, clothed in fine linen, clean and white, veiled in humility and meekness, bore in his mind those earthly features. No, he never had dreamed of that. But only after she had passed by, that mystical vision seemed to him more radiant, more easy to be conceived. It is said that if a grapevine be planted in the neighborhood of a well, its roots, running silently underground, wreathe themselves in a network around the cold, clear waters, and the vines putting on outward greenness and unwanted clusters and fruit is all that tells where every root and fiber of its being has been silently stealing. So those loves are most fatal, most absorbing, in which with unheeded quietness every thought and fiber of our life twines gradually around some human soul, to us the unsuspected wellspring of our being. Fearful it is, because so often the vine must be uprooted and all its fibers wrenched away. But till the hour of discovery comes, how is it transfigured by a new and beautiful life? There is nothing in life more beautiful than that trance-like quiet dawn which precedes the rising of love in the soul, when the whole being is pervaded imperceptibly and tranquilly by another being, and we are happy. We know not and ask not why. The soul is then receiving all and asking nothing. At a later day she becomes self-conscious, and then come craving, exactions, endless questions. The whole world of the material comes in with its hard counsels and consultations, and the beautiful trance fades forever. Of course, all this is not so to you, my good friends, who read it without the most distant idea what it can mean, but there are people in the world to whom it has meant and will mean much, and who will see in the present happiness of our respectable friends something even ominous and sorrowful. It had not escaped the keen eye of the mother how quickly and innocently the good doctor was absorbed by her daughter, and thereupon had come long trains of practical reflections. The doctor, though not popular indeed as a preacher, was a noted man in his age. Her deceased husband had regarded him with something of the same veneration which might have been accorded to a divine messenger, and Mrs. Scudder had received and kept this veneration as a precious legacy. Then, although not handsome, the doctor had decidedly a grand and imposing appearance. There was nothing common or insignificant about him. Indeed, it had been said that when, just after the declaration of peace, he walked through the town in the commemorative procession, side by side with General Washington, the minister, in the majesty of his gown, bands, cocked hat, and full flowing wig, was thought by many to be the more majestic and personable figure of the two. In those days the minister united in himself all those ideas of superior position and cultivation with which the theocratic system of the New England community had invested him. Mrs. Scudder's notions of social rank could reach no higher than to place her daughter on the throne of such preeminence. Her Mary, she pondered, was no common girl. In those days it was a rare thing for young persons to devote themselves to religion or make any professions of devout life. The church, or that body of people who professed to have passed through a divine regeneration, was almost entirely confined to middle-aged and elderly people, and it was looked upon as a singular and unwonted call of divine grace when young persons came forward to attach themselves to it. When Mary, therefore, at quite an early age, in all the bloom of her youthful beauty, arose, according to the simple and impressive New England rite, to consecrate herself publicly to a religious life, and to join the company of professing Christians, she was regarded with a species of deference amounting even to awe. Had it not been for the childlike, unconscious simplicity of her manners, the young people of her age would have shrunk away from her, as from one entirely out of their line of thought and feeling. But a certain natural and innocent playfulness and amiable self-forgetfulness made her a general favourite. Nevertheless, Mrs. Scudder knew no young man whom she deemed worthy to have and hold a heart which she prized so highly. As to James, he stood at double disadvantage, because, as her cousin's son, he had grown up from childhood under her eye, and all those sins and iniquities into which gay and adventurous youngsters will be falling had come to her knowledge. She felt kindly to the youth, she wished him well, but as to giving him her Mary, the very suggestion made her dislike him. She was quite sure he must have tried to beguile her. He must have tampered with her feelings to arouse in her pure and well-ordered mind so much emotion and devotedness as she had witnessed. How encouraging a providence, then, was it that he was gone to sea for 3 years. How fortunate that Mary had been prevented in any way from committing herself with him. How encouraging that the only man in those parts, in the least fitted to appreciate her, seemed so greatly pleased and absorbed in her society. How easily might Mary's dutiful reverence be changed to a warmer sentiment, when she should find that so great a man could descend from his lofty thoughts to think of her. In fact, before Mrs. Scudder had gone to sleep the first night after James's departure, she had settled upon the house where the minister and his young wife were to live, had reviewed the window curtains and bed quilts for each room, and glanced complacently at an improved receipt for wedding cake, which might be brought out to glorify a certain occasion. End of section 7. Section 8 of The Minister's Wooing. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Minister's Wooing by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Chapter 7. The Friends and Relations of James. Mr. Zebedee Marvin, the father of James, was the sample of an individuality so purely the result of New England society and education that he must be embodied in our story as a representative man of the times. He owned a large farm in the immediate vicinity of Newport, which he worked with his own hands and kept under the most careful cultivation. He was a man past the middle of life, with a white head, a keen blue eye, and a face graven deeply with the lines of energy and thought. His was one of those clearly cut minds which New England forms among her farmers, as she forms quartz crystals in her mountains, by a sort of gradual influence flowing through every pore of her soil and system. His education, properly so called, had been merely that of those common schools and academies with which the states are thickly sown, and which are the springs of so much intellectual activity. Here he had learned to think and to inquire, a process which had not ceased with his school days. Though toiling daily with his sons and hired man in all the minutiae of a farmer's life, he kept an observant eye on the field of literature, and there was not a new publication heard of that he did not immediately find means to add it to his yearly increasing stock of books. In particular was he a well-read and careful theologian, and all the controversial tracts, sermons, and books, with which then, as ever since, New England has abounded, not only lay on his shelves, but had his penciled annotations, queries, and comments thickly scattered along their margins. There was scarce an office of public trust which had not at one time or another been filled by him. He was deacon of the church, chairman of the school committee, justice of the peace, had been twice representative in the state legislature, and was in permanence a sort of adviser general in all cases between neighbor and neighbor. Among other acquisitions, he had gained some knowledge of the general forms of law, and his advice was often asked in preference to that of the regular practitioners. His dwelling was one of those large, square, white, green-blinded mansions, cool, clean, and roomy, wherein the respectability of New England in those days rejoiced. The windows were shaded by clumps of lilacs. The deep yard, with its white fence, enclosed a sweep of clean, short grass and a few fruit trees. Opposite the house was a small blacksmith's shed, which of a wet day was sparkling and lively with bellows and ringing forge, while Mr. Zebedee and his sons were hammering and pounding and putting in order anything that was out of the way in farming tools or establishments. Not unfrequently the latest scientific work or last tractate of theology lay open by his side, the contents of which would be discussed with a neighbor or two as they entered. For, to say the truth, many a neighbor, less forehanded and thrifty, felt the benefit of this arrangement of Mr. Zebedee, and would drop in to see if he wouldn't just tighten that rivet, or kind of ease out that air brace, or let a feller have a turn with his bellows, or a stroke or two on his anvil, to all which the good man consented with a grave obligingness. The fact was that as nothing in the establishment of Mr. Marvyn was often broken or lost or out of place, he had frequent applications to lend to those less fortunate persons always to be found, who supply their own lack of considerateness from the abundance of their neighbors. He who is known always to be in hand and always obliging in a neighborhood stands the chance sometimes of having nothing for himself. Mr. Zebedee reflected quietly on this subject, taking it as he did all others into grave and orderly consideration, and finally provided a complete set of tools, which he kept for the purpose of lending. And when any of these were lent, he told the next applicant quietly that the axe or the hoe was already out, and thus he reconciled the Scripture which commanded him to do good and lend with that law of order which was written in his nature. Early in life, Mr. Marvyn had married one of the handsomest girls of his acquaintance, who had brought him a thriving and healthy family of children, of whom James was the youngest. Mrs. Marvyn was, at this time, a tall, sad-eyed, gentle-mannered woman, thoughtful, earnest, deep-natured, though sparing in the matter of words. In all her household arrangements, she had the same thrift and order which characterized her husband, but hers was a mind of a finer and higher stamp than his. In her bedroom, near by her work-basket, stood a table covered with books, and so systematic were her household arrangements that she never any day missed her regular hours for reading. One who should have looked over this table would have seen there how eager and hungry a mind was hid behind the silent eyes of this quiet woman. History, biography, mathematics, volumes of the encyclopedia, poetry, novels, all alike found their time and place there, and while she pursued her household labors, the busy, active soul within travelled cycles and cycles of thought, few of which ever found expression in words. What might be that marvellous music of the Miserere of which she read, that it convulsed crowds and drew groans and tears from the most obdurate? What might be those wondrous pictures of Raphael and Leonardo da Vinci? What would it be to see the Apollo, the Venus? What was the charm that enchanted the old marbles, charm untold and inconceivable to one who had never seen even the slightest approach to a work of art? Then those glaciers of Switzerland, that grand unapproachable mixture of beauty and sublimity in her mountains, what would it be to one who could see it? Then what were all those harmonies of which she read, masses, fugues, symphonies? Oh, could she once hear the Miserere of Mozart, just to know what music was like? And the cathedrals, what were they? How wonderful they must be, with their forests of arches, many-coloured as autumn woods with painted glass, and the chants and anthems rolling down their long aisles. On all these things she pondered quietly as she sat often on Sundays in the old staring rattle-windowed meeting-house, and looked at the uncouth old pulpit, and heard the choir fa-sol-la-ing or singing fuguing tunes, but of all this she said nothing. Sometimes for days her thoughts would turn from these subjects and be absorbed in mathematical or metaphysical studies. I have been following that treatise on optics for a week, and never understood it till today, she once said to her husband. I have found now that there has been a mistake in drawing the diagrams. I have corrected it, and now the demonstration is complete. Dinah, take care, that wood is hickory, and it takes only 7 sticks of that size to heat the oven. It is not to be supposed that a woman of this sort was an inattentive listener to preaching so stimulating to the intellect as that of Dr. H. No pair of eyes followed the web of his reasonings with a keener and more anxious watchfulness than those sad, deep-set hazel ones, and as she was drawn along the train of its inevitable logic, a close observer might have seen how the shadows deepened over them. For while others listened for the clearness of the thought, for the acuteness of the argument, she listened as a soul wide, fine-strung, acute, repressed, whose every fibre is a nerve, listens to the problem of its own destiny, listened as the mother of a family listens, to know what were the possibilities, the probabilities of this mysterious existence of ours to herself and those dearer to her than herself. The consequence of all her listening was a history of deep inward sadness. That exultant joy, or that entire submission with which others seemed to view the scheme of the universe as thus unfolded, did not visit her mind. Everything to her seemed shrouded in gloom and mystery, and that darkness she received as a token of unregeneracy, as a sign that she was one of those who are destined by a mysterious decree never to receive the light of the glorious gospel of Christ. Hence, while her husband was a deacon of the church, she for years had sat in her pew while the sacramental elements were distributed, a mournful spectator. Punctilious in every duty, exact, reverential, she still regarded herself as a child of wrath, an enemy to God, and an heir of perdition. Nor could she see any hope of remedy, except in the sovereign, mysterious decree of an infinite and unknown power, a mercy for which she waited with the sickness of hope deferred. Her children had grown up successively around her, intelligent and exemplary. Her eldest son was mathematical professor in one of the leading colleges of New England. Her second son, who jointly with his father superintended the farm, was a man of wide literary culture and of fine mathematical genius, and not unfrequently on winter evenings the son, father, and mother worked together, by their kitchen fireside over the calculations for the almanac for the ensuing year, which the son had been appointed to edit. Everything in the family arrangements was marked by a sober precision, a grave and quiet self-possession. There was little demonstrativeness of affection between parents and children, brothers and sisters, though great mutual affection and confidence. It was not pride nor sternness, but a sort of habitual shamefacedness that kept far back in each soul those feelings which are the most beautiful in their outcome. But after a while the habit became so fixed a nature that a caressing or affectionate expression could not have passed the lips of one to another without a painful awkwardness. Love was understood once for all to be the basis on which their life was built. Once for all they loved each other, and after that, the less said the better. It had cost the woman's heart of Mrs. Marvyn some pangs in the earlier part of her wedlock to accept of this once for all, in place of those daily outgushings which every woman desires should be like God's loving kindness, new every morning. But hers, too, was a nature strongly inclining inward, and after a few tremulous movements the needle of her soul settled, and her life-lot was accepted, not as what she would like or could conceive, but as a reasonable and good one. Life was a picture painted in low, cool tones, but in perfect keeping, and though another and brighter style might have pleased better, she did not quarrel with this. Into this steady, decorous, highly respectable circle, the youngest child, James, made a formidable irruption. One sometimes sees launched into a family circle a child of so different a nature from all the rest, that it might seem as if, like an aerolite, he had fallen out of another sphere. All the other babies of the Marvyn family had been of that orderly, contented sort, who sleep till it is convenient to take them up, and while awake suck their thumbs contentedly, and look up with large round eyes at the ceiling when it is not convenient for their elders and betters that they should do anything else. In farther advanced childhood they had been quiet and decorous children, who could be all dressed and set up in chairs like so many dolls of a Sunday morning, patiently awaiting the stroke of the church bell to be carried out and put into the wagon which took them over the 2 miles road to church. Possessed of such tranquil, orderly, and exemplary young offshoots, Mrs. Marvyn had been considered eminent for her faculty in bringing up children. But James was destined to put faculty and every other talent which his mother possessed to rout. He was an infant of moods and tenses, and those not of any regular verb. He would cry of nights, and he would be taken up of mornings, and he would not suck his thumb, nor a bundle of caraway seed tied in a rag and dipped in sweet milk, with which the good gossips in vain endeavoured to pacify him. He fought manfully with his 2 great fat fists the battle of babyhood, utterly reversed all nursery maxims, and reigned as baby over the whole prostrate household. When old enough to run alone, his splendid black eyes and glossy rings of hair were seen flashing and bobbing in every forbidden place and occupation. Now, trailing on his mother's gown, he assisted her in salting her butter by throwing in small contributions of snuff or sugar, as the case might be. And again, after one of those mysterious periods of silence which are of most ominous significance in nursery experience, he would rise from the demolition of her indigo bag, showing a face ghastly with blue streaks, and looking more like a gnome than the son of a respectable mother. There was not a picture of any description of contents left within reach of his little tiptoes and busy fingers that was not pulled over upon his giddy head without in the least seeming to improve its steadiness. In short, his mother remarked that she was thankful every night when she had fairly gotten him into bed and asleep. James had really got through one more day and killed neither himself nor anyone else. As a boy, the case was little better. He did not take to study, yawned over books, and cut out molds for running anchors when he should have been thinking of his columns of words in 4 syllables. No mortal knew how he learned to read, for he never seemed to stop running long enough to learn anything. And yet he did learn, and used the talent in conning over travels, sea voyages, and lives of heroes and naval commanders. Spite of father, mother, and brother, he seemed to possess the most extraordinary faculty of running up unsavory acquaintances. He was a hail fellow well met with every Tom and Jack and Jim and Ben and Dick that strolled on the wharves, and astonished his father with minutest particulars of every ship, schooner, and brig in the harbor, together with biographical notes of the different Toms, Dicks, and Harrys by whom they were worked. There was but one member of the family that seemed to know at all what to make of James, and that was their Negro servant, Candace. In those days, when domestic slavery prevailed in New England, it was quite a different thing in its aspects from the same institution in more southern latitudes. The hard soil, unyielding to any but the most considerate culture, the thrifty, close, shrewd habits of the people, and their untiring activity and industry prevented among the mass of the people any great reliance on slave labor. It was something foreign, grotesque, and picturesque in a life of the most matter-of-fact sameness. It was even as if one should see clusters of palm trees scattered here and there among Yankee wooden meeting-houses, or open one's eyes on clumps of yellow-striped aloes growing among hardhack and huckleberry bushes in the pastures. Added to this, there were from the very first in New England serious doubts in the minds of thoughtful and conscientious people in reference to the lawfulness of slavery, and this scruple prevented many from availing themselves of it, and proved a restraint on all, so that nothing like plantation life existed, and what servants were owned were scattered among different families, of which they came to be regarded, and to regard themselves as a legitimate part and portion. Mr. Marvyn is a man of substance, numbering 2 or 3 in his establishment, among whom Candace reigned chief. The presence of these tropical specimens of humanity, with their wide, joyous, rich physical abundance of nature, and their hearty abandon of outward expression, was a relief to the still clear-cut lines in which the picture of New England life was drawn, which an artist must appreciate. No race has ever shown such infinite and rich capabilities of adaptation to varying soil and circumstances as the Negro. Alike to them, the snows of Canada, the hard rocky land of New England with its set lines and orderly ways, or the gorgeous profusion and loose abundance of the southern states, Sambo and Cuffy expand under them all. New England yet preserves among her hills and valleys the lingering echoes of the jokes and jollities of various sable worthies, who saw alike in orthodoxy and heterodoxy, in doctor this side and doctor that side, only food for more abundant merriment. In fact, the minister of those days not unfrequently had his black shadow, a sort of African Boswell, who powdered his wig, brushed his boots, defended and patronized his sermons, and strutted complacently about, as if through virtue of his blackness he had absorbed every ray of his master's dignity and wisdom. In families, the presence of these exotics was a godsend to the children, supplying from the abundant outwardness and demonstrativeness of their nature that aliment of sympathy so dear to childhood, which the repressed and quiet habits of New England education denied. Many and many a New Englander counts among his pleasantest early recollections the memory of some of these genial creatures, who by their warmth of nature were the first and most potent mesmerizers of his childish mind. Candace was a powerfully built, majestic black woman, corpulent, heavy, with a swinging majesty of motion like that of a ship in a groundswell. Her shining black skin and glistening white teeth were indications of perfect physical vigor, which had never known a day's sickness. Her turban, of broad red and yellow bandana stripes, had even a warm tropical glow, and her ample skirts were always ready to be spread over every childish transgression of her youngest pet and favorite, James. She used to hold him entranced long winter evenings while she sat knitting in the chimney corner, and crooned to him strange, wild African legends of the things that she had seen in her childhood and early days, for she had been stolen when about 15 years of age, and these weird dreamy talks increased the fervor of his roving imagination and his desire to explore the wonders of the wide and unknown world. When rebuked or chastised, it was she who had secret bowels of mercy for him, and hid doughnuts in her ample bosom to be secretly administered to him in mitigation of the sentence that sent him supperless to bed, and many a triangle of pie, many a wedge of cake, had conveyed to him surreptitious consolations which his more conscientious mother longed but dared not to impart. In fact, these ministrations, if suspected, were winked at by Mrs. Marvyn for two reasons. First, that mothers are generally glad of any loving kindness to an erring boy, which they are not responsible for. And second, that Candace was so set in her ways and opinions that one might as well come in front of a ship under full sail as endeavor to stop her in a matter where her heart was engaged. To be sure, she had her own private and special quarrels with Massa James when he disputed any of her sovereign orders in the kitchen, and would sometimes pursue him with uplifted rolling-pin and floury hands when he had snatched a ginger nut or cookie without suitable deference or supplication, and would declare roundly that there never was sich an aggravatin' young'un. But if on the strength of this anyone else ventured a reproof, Candace was immediately round on the other side. "Dat ar child gwine to be spiled, 'cause dey's allers a pickin' on him. He's well enough, only let him alone." Well, under this miscellaneous assortment of influences, through the order and gravity and solemn monotone of life at home, with the unceasing tick-tack of the clock forever resounding through clean, empty-seeming rooms, through the sea, ever shining, ever smiling, dimpling, soliciting, like a magical charger who comes saddled and bridled and offers to take you to fairyland, through acquaintance with all sorts of foreign outlandish ragamuffins among the ships in the harbor, from disgust of slow-moving oxen and long-drawn, endless furrows round the 15-acre lot, from misunderstandings with grave elder brothers, and feeling somehow as if, he knew not why, he grieved his mother all the time, just by being what he was and couldn't help being. And finally, by a bitter break with his father, in which came that last wrench for an individual existence, which some time or other the young growing mind will give to old authority. By all these united was the lot at length cast, for one evening James was missing at supper, missing by the fireside, gone all night, not at home to breakfast, till finally a strange, weird, most heathenish-looking cabin-boy, who had often been forbidden the premises by Mr. Marvyn, brought in a letter, half defiant, half penitent, which announced that James had sailed in the Ariel the evening before. Mr. Zebedee Marvyn set his face as a flint and said he went out from us because he was not of us, whereat old Candace lifted her great floury fist from the kneading trough, and shaking it like a large snowball, said, "Oh, you go 'long, Massa Marvyn, Ye'll live to count dat ar boy for de staff of your old age yet. Now I tell you, got to make an attend of nary men in him. Kittles that's full of arlers will bile over. Good yeast will blow out de cork. Luck he ef it don't bust de bottle. Tell you, dere's angels has de hooks in sich, and when de Lord wants him, dey'll haul him in safe and sound. And Candace concluded her speech by giving a lift to her whole batch of dough and flinging it down in the trough with an emphasis that made the pewter on the dresser rattle. This apparently irreverent way of expressing her mind, so contrary to the deferential habit studiously inculcated in family discipline, had grown to be so much a matter of course to all the family that nobody ever thought of rebuking it. There was a sort of savage freedom about her which they excused in right of her having been born and bred a heathen, and of course not to be expected to come at once under the yoke of civilization. In fact, you must all have noticed, my dear readers, that there are some sorts of people for whom everybody turns out as they would for a railroad car without stopping to ask why, and Candace was one of them. Moreover, Mr. Marvyn was not displeased with this defence of James, as might be inferred from his mentioning it 4 or 5 times in the course of the morning to say how foolish it was, wondering why it was that Candace and everybody else got so infatuated with that boy, and ending at last, after a long period of thought, with the remark that these poor African creatures often seemed to have a great deal of shrewdness in them, and that he was often astonished at the penetration that Candace showed. At the end of the year, James came home more quiet and manly than he had ever been known before, so handsome with his sunburnt face and his keen dark eyes and glossy curls that half the girls in the front gallery lost their hearts the first Sunday he appeared in church. He was tender as a woman to his mother, and followed her with his eyes like a lover wherever she went. He made due and manly acknowledgments to his father, but declared his fixed and settled intention to abide by the profession he had chosen, and he brought home all sorts of strange foreign gifts for every member of the household. Candace was glorified with a flaming red and yellow turban of Moorish stuff from Mogador, together with a pair of gorgeous yellow Morocco slippers with peaked toes, which, though there appeared no call to wear them in her common course of life, she would put on her fat feet and contemplate with daily satisfaction. She became increasingly strengthened thereby in the conviction that the angels who had their hooks in Master James's jacket were already beginning to shorten the line. End of section 8. Section 9 of The Minister's Wooing. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Minister's Wooing by Harriet Beecher Stowe, Chapter 8, which treats of romance. There is no word in the English language more unceremoniously and indefinitely kicked and cuffed about by what are called sensible people than the word romance. When Mr. Smith or Mr. Stubbs has brought every wheel of life into such range and order that it is one steady daily grind, when they themselves have come into the habits and attitudes of the patient donkey who steps round and round the endlessly turning wheel of some machinery, then they fancy that they have gotten the victory that overcometh the world. All but this dead grind and the dollars that come through the mill is by them thrown into one waste catch-all and labeled romance. Perhaps there was a time in Mr. Smith's youth, he remembers it now, when he read poetry, when his cheek was wet with strange tears, when a little song ground out by an organ grinder in the street had power to set his heart beating and bring a mist before his eyes. Ah, in those days he had a vision. A pair of soft eyes stirred him strangely. A little weak hand was laid on his manhood, and it shook and trembled. And then came all the humility, the aspiration, the fear, the hope, the high desire, the troubling of the waters by the descending angel of love. And a little more, and Mr. Smith might have become a man instead of a banker. He thinks of it now sometimes as he looks across the fireplace after dinner and sees Mrs. Smith asleep, innocently shaking the bouquet of pink bows and Brussels lace that waves over her placid red countenance. Mrs. Smith wasn't his first love, nor indeed any love at all, but they agreed reasonably well. And as for poor Nellie, well, she is dead and buried. All that was stuff and romance. Mrs. Smith's money set him up in business, and Mrs. Smith is a capital manager, and he thanks God that he isn't romantic, and tells Smith Jr. not to read poetry or novels and to stick to realities. This is the victory that overcometh the world, to learn to be fat and tranquil, to have warm fires and good dinners, to hang your hat on the same peg at the same hour every day, to sleep soundly all night, and never to trouble your head with a thought or imagining beyond. But there are many people besides Mr. Smith who have gained this victory, who have strangled their higher nature and buried it, and built over its grave the structure of their life the better to keep it down. The fascinating Mrs. T., whose life is a whirl between ball and opera, point lace, diamonds, and schemings of admiration for herself and of establishments for her daughters, there was a time, if you will believe me, when that proud worldly woman was so humbled under the touch of some mighty power that she actually thought herself capable of being a poor man's wife. She thought she could live in a little mean house on no matter what street with one servant, and make her own bonnets and mend her own clothes and sweep the house Mondays while Betty washed, all for what? All because she thought that there was a man so noble, so true, so good, so high-minded, that to live with him in poverty, to be guided by him in adversity, to lean on him in every rough place of life, was a something nobler, better, purer, more satisfying than French laces, opera boxes, and even Madame Roget's best gowns. Unfortunately, this was all romance. There was no such man. There was indeed a person of very common, self-interested aims and worldly nature, whom she had credited at sight with an unlimited draught on all her better nature, and when the hour of discovery came, she awoke from her dream with a start and a laugh, and ever since has despised aspiration and been busy with the realities of life, and feeds poor little Mary Jane, who sits by her in the opera box there with all the fruit which she has picked from the bitter tree of knowledge. There is no end of the epigrams and witticisms which she can throw out, this elegant Mrs. T., on people who marry for love, lead prosy, worky lives, and put on their best cap with pink ribbons for Sunday. Mary Jane shall never make a fool of herself, but even as she speaks, poor Mary Jane's heart is dying within her at the vanishing of a pair of whiskers from an opposite box, which whiskers the poor little fool has credited with a résumé drawn from her own imaginings of all that is grandest and most heroic, most worshipful in man. By and by, when Mrs. T. finds the glamour has fallen on her daughter, she wonders. She has tried to keep novels out of the girl's way. Where did she get these notions? All prosaic and all bitter, disenchanted people talk as if poets and novelists made romance. They do, just as much as craters make volcanoes, no more. What is romance? Whence comes it? Plato spoke to the subject wisely in his quaint way some 2,000 years ago, when he said, "Man's soul in a former state was winged and soared among the gods. And so it comes to pass that in this life, when the soul by the power of music or poetry or the sight of beauty hath her remembrance quickened, forthwith there is a struggling and a pricking pain as of wings trying to come forth, even as children in teething." And if an old heathen 2,000 years ago discoursed thus gravely of the romantic part of our nature, whence comes it that in Christian lands we think in so pagan a way of it, and turn the whole care of it to ballad makers, romancers, and opera singers? Let us look up in fear and reverence and say, God is the great maker of romance, He from whose hand came man and woman, He who strung the great harp of existence with all its wild and wonderful and manifold chords, and attuned them to one another. He is the great poet of life. Every impulse of beauty, of heroism, and every craving for purer love, fairer perfection, nobler type and style of being than that which closes like a prison house around us in the dim daily walk of life, is God's breath, God's impulse, God's reminder to the soul that there is something higher, sweeter, purer, yet to be attained. Therefore, man or woman, when thy ideal is shattered, as shattered 1,000 times it must be, when the vision fades, the rapture burns out, turn not away in skepticism and bitterness, saying, there is nothing better for a man than that he should eat and drink, but rather cherish the revelations of those hours as prophecies and foreshadowings of something real and possible, yet to be attained in the manhood of immortality. The scoffing spirit that laughs at romance is an apple of the devil's own handing from the bitter tree of knowledge. It opens the eyes only to see eternal nakedness. If ever you have had a romantic, uncalculating friendship, a boundless worship and belief in some hero of your soul, if ever you have so loved that all cold prudence, all selfish worldly considerations have gone down like driftwood before a river flooded with new rain from heaven, so that you even forgot yourself and were ready to cast your whole being into the chasm of existence as an offering before the feet of another, and all for nothing. If you awoke bitterly betrayed and deceived, still give thanks to God that you have had one glimpse of heaven. The door now shut will open again. Rejoice that the noblest capability of your eternal inheritance has been made known to you. Treasure it as the highest honor of your being, that ever you could so feel, that so divine a guest ever possessed your soul. By such experiences are we taught the pathos, the sacredness of life. And if we use them wisely, our eyes will ever after be anointed to see what poems, what romances, what sublime tragedies lie around us in the daily walk of life, written not with ink but in fleshly tables of the heart. The dullest street of the most prosaic town has matter in it for more smiles, more tears, more intense excitement than ever were written in story or sung in poem. The reality is there, of which the romancer is the second-hand recorder. So much of a plea we put in boldly, because we foresee grave heads beginning to shake over our history, and doubts rising in reverent and discreet minds whether this history is going to prove anything but a love story after all. We do assure you, right reverend sir, and you most discreet madam, that it is not going to prove anything else. And you will find, if you will follow us, that there is as much romance burning under the snowbanks of cold Puritan preciseness as if Dr. H. had been brought up to attend operas instead of metaphysical preaching, and Mary had been nourished on Byron's poetry instead of Edwards on the affections. The innocent credulities, the subtle deceptions that were quietly at work under the grave, white curls of the doctor's wig were exactly of the kind which have beguiled man in all ages when near the sovereign presence of her who is born for his destiny. And as for Mary, what did it avail her that she could say the Assembly's catechism from end to end without tripping, and that every habit of her life beat time to practical realities steadily as the parlor clock? The wildest Italian singer or dancer, nursed on nothing but excitement from her cradle, never was more thoroughly possessed by the awful and solemn mystery of woman's life than this Puritan girl. It is quite true that the next morning after James's departure she rose as usual in the dim grey, and was to be seen opening the kitchen door just at the moment when the birds were giving the first little drowsy stir and chirp, and that she went on setting the breakfast table for the 2 hired men who were bound to the fields with the oxen, and that then she went on skimming cream for the butter and getting ready to churn and making up biscuit for the doctor's breakfast when he and they should sit down together at a somewhat later hour. And as she moved about doing all these things, she sung various scraps of old psalm tunes, and the good doctor, who was then busy with his early exercises of devotion, listened as he heard the voice, now here, now there, and thought about angels and the millennium. Solemnly and tenderly there floated in at his open study window through the breezy lilacs mixed with low of kine and bleat of sheep and hum of early wakening life, the little silvery ripples of that singing, somewhat mournful in its cadence, as if a gentle soul were striving to hush itself to rest. The words were those of the rough old version of the Psalms then in use. Truly, my waiting soul relies in silence God upon, because from him there doth arise all my salvation. And then came the busy patter of the little footsteps without, the moving of chairs, the clink of plates, as busy hands were arranging the table. And then again there was a pause, and he thought she seemed to come near to the open window of the adjoining room, for the voice floated in clearer and sadder. O God, to me be merciful to me, because my soul for shelter safe betakes itself to thee. Yea, in the shadow of thy wings my refuge have I placed, until these sore calamities shall quite be overpast. The tone of life in New England, so habitually earnest and solemn, breathed itself in the grave and plaintive melodies of the tunes then sung in the churches, and so these words, though in the saddest minor key, did not suggest to the listening ear of the auditor anything more than that pensive religious calm in which he delighted to repose. A contrast indeed they were in their melancholy earnestness to the exuberant carolings of a robin, who, apparently attracted by them, perched himself hard by in the lilacs and struck up such a merry roulade as quite diverted the attention of the fair singer. In fact, the intoxication breathed in the strain of this little messenger, whom God had feathered and winged and filled to the throat with ignorant joy, came in singular contrast with the sadder notes breathed by that creature of so much higher mould and fairer clay, that creature born for an immortal life. But the good doctor was inly pleased when she sung, and when she stopped, looked up from his Bible wistfully, as missing something, he knew not what, for he scarce thought how pleasant the little voice was, or knew he had been listening to it, and yet he was in a manner enchanted by it, so thankful and happy that he exclaimed with fervour, "The lines are fallen unto me in pleasant places, yea, I have a goodly heritage." So went the world with him, full of joy and praise, because the voice and the presence wherein lay his unsuspected life were securely near, so certainly and constantly a part of his daily walk that he had not even the trouble to wish for them. But in that other heart, how was it? How with the sweet saint that was talking to herself in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs? The good child had remembered her mother's parting words the night before, "Put your mind upon your duties," and had begun her first conscious exercise of thought with a prayer that grace might be given her to do it. But even as she spoke, mingling and interweaving with that golden thread of prayer, was another consciousness, a life in another soul, as she prayed that the grace of God might overshadow him, shield him from temptation, and lead him up to heaven. And this prayer so got the start of the other, that ere she was aware, she had quite forgotten self, and was feeling, living, thinking in that other life. The first discovery she made when she looked out into the fragrant orchard whose perfume steamed in at her window, and listened to the first chirping of birds among the old apple trees, was one that has astonished many a person before her. It was this:
She found that all that had made life interesting to her was suddenly gone. She herself had not known that, for the month past, since James came from sea, she had been living in an enchanted land. That Newport harbor, and every rock and stone, and every mat of yellow seaweed on the shore, that the 2-mile road between the cottage and the white house of Zebedee Marvin, every mullein stalk, every juniper tree, had all had a light and a charm which were suddenly gone. There had not been an hour in the day for the last 4 weeks that had not had its unsuspected interest, because he was at the White House, because possibly he might be going by or coming in, nay, even in church, when she stood up to sing and thought she was thinking only of God, had she not been conscious of that tenor voice that poured itself out by her side, and though afraid to turn her head that way, had she not felt that he was there every moment, heard every word of the sermon and prayer for him. The very vigilant care which her mother had taken to prevent private interviews had only served to increase the interest by throwing over it the veil of constraint and mystery. Silent looks, involuntary starts, things indicated, not expressed, these are the most dangerous, the most seductive aliment of thought to a delicate and sensitive nature. If things were said out, they might not be said wisely, they might repel by their freedom or disturb by their unfitness, but what is only looked is sent into the soul through the imagination, which makes of it all that the ideal faculties desire. In a refined and exalted nature, it is very seldom that the feeling of love, when once thoroughly aroused, bears any sort of relation to the reality of the object. It is commonly an enkindling of the whole power of the soul's love for whatever she considers highest and fairest. It is, in fact, the love of something divine and unearthly, which by a sort of illusion connects itself with a personality. Properly speaking, there is but one true eternal object of all that the mind conceives in this trance of its exaltation. Disenchantment must come, of course, and in a love which terminates in happy marriage, there is a tender and gracious process by which, without shock or violence, the ideal is gradually sunk in the real, which, though found faulty and earthly, is still ever tenderly remembered as it seemed under the morning light of that enchantment. What Mary loved so passionately, that which came between her and God in every prayer, was not the gay, young, dashing sailor, sudden in anger, imprudent of speech, and though generous in heart, yet worldly in plans and schemings, but her own ideal of a grand and noble man, such a man as she thought he might become. He stood glorified before her, an image of the strength that overcomes things physical, of the power of command which controls men and circumstances, of the courage which disdains fear, of the honor which cannot lie, of constancy which knows no shadow of turning, of tenderness which protects the weak, and lastly, of religious loyalty which should lay the golden crown of its perfected manhood at the feet of a sovereign Lord and Redeemer. This was the man she loved, and with this regal mantle of glory she invested the person called James Marvin, and all that she saw and felt to be wanting she prayed for with the faith of a believing woman. Nor was she wrong, for as to every leaf and every flower there is an ideal to which the growth of the plant is constantly urging. So is there an ideal to every human being, a perfect form in which it might appear, were every defect removed and every characteristic excellence stimulated to the highest point. Once in an age God sends to some of us a friend who loves in us not a false imagining, an unreal character, but looking through all the rubbish of our imperfections, loves in us the divine ideal of our nature, loves not the man that we are, but the angel that we may be. Such friends seem inspired by a divine gift of prophecy, like the mother of St. Augustine, who, in the midst of the wayward, reckless youth of her son, beheld him in a vision, standing, clothed in white, a ministering priest at the right hand of God, as he has stood for long ages since. Could a mysterious foresight unveil to us this resurrection form of the friends with whom we daily walk, compassed about with mortal infirmity, we should follow them with faith and reverence through all the disguises of human faults and weaknesses, waiting for the manifestation of the sons of God. But these wonderful soul friends to whom God grants such perception are the exceptions in life. Yet sometimes are we blessed with one who sees through us, as Michelangelo saw through a block of marble when he attacked it in a divine fervor, declaring that an angel was imprisoned within it. And it is often the resolute and delicate hand of such a friend that sets the angel free. There be soul artists who go through this world looking among their fellows with reverence, as one looks amid the dust and rubbish of old shops for hidden works of Titian and Leonardo, and finding them, however cracked or torn or painted over with tawdry daubs of pretenders, immediately recognize the divine original and set themselves to cleanse and restore. Such be God's real priests, whose ordination and anointing are from the Holy Spirit. And he who hath not this enthusiasm is not ordained of God, though whole synods of bishops laid hands on him. Many such priests there be among women, for to this silent ministry their nature calls them, endowed as it is with fineness of fibre and a subtle keenness of perception, outrunning slow-footed reason, and she of whom we write was one of these. At this very moment, while the crimson wings of morning were casting delicate reflections on tree and bush and rock, they were also reddening innumerable waves round a ship that sailed alone with a wide horizon stretching like an eternity around it. And in the advancing morning stood a young man thoughtfully looking off into the ocean with a book in his hand, James Marvyn, as truly and heartily a creature of this material world as Mary was of the invisible and heavenly. There are some who seem made to live. Life is such a joy to them. Their senses are so fully en rapport with all outward things. The world is so keenly appreciable, so much a part of themselves. They are so conscious of power and victory in the government and control of material things, that the moral and invisible life often seems to hang tremulous and unreal in their minds, like the pale faded moon in the light of a gorgeous sunrise. When brought face to face with the great truths of the invisible world, they stand related to the higher wisdom, much like the gorgeous, gay Alcibiades to the divine Socrates, or like the young man in Holy Writ to him for whose appearing Socrates longed. They gaze, imperfectly comprehending, and at the call of ambition or riches turn away sorrowing. So it was with James. In full tide of worldly energy and ambition, there had been forming over his mind that hard crust, that skepticism of the spiritual and exalted which men of the world delight to call practical sense. He had been suddenly arrested and humbled by the revelation of a nature so much nobler than his own that he seemed worthless in his own eyes. He had asked for love, but when such love unveiled itself, he felt like the disciple of old in the view of a diviner tenderness. "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man." But it is not often that all the current of a life is reversed in 1 hour. And now, as James stood on the ship's deck, with life passing around him, and everything drawing upon the strings of old habits, Mary and her religion recurred to his mind as some fair, sweet, inexplicable vision. Where she stood he saw, but how he was ever to get there seemed as incomprehensible as how a mortal man should pillow his form on sunset clouds. He held the little Bible in his hand as if it were some amulet charmed by the touch of a superior being. But when he strove to read it, his thoughts wandered, and he shut it, troubled and unsatisfied. Yet there were within him yearnings and cravings, wants never felt before, the beginning of that trouble which must ever precede the soul's rise to a higher plan of being. There we leave him. We have shown you now our three different characters, each one in its separate sphere, feeling the force of that strongest and holiest power with which it has pleased our great author to glorify this mortal life. End of section 9.